I want to get out of poverty by making songs. Getting Paul's okay was very important to George. It meant more to me that he was encouraging me than any praise. At that point, George thought he had found not only a partner but also someone who, but respect, quickly turned into dislike. As the Beatles went from playing in small clubs to performing all over the world, Paul and John became the most famous songwriters, the faces of Beatlemania, the sounds on magazine covers, and the stars who were asked to do every interview. George, on the other hand, kept to himself. Everyone thought that label was innocent, even cute, but George saw it as a jail. He wasn't quiet because he didn't have anything to say. He didn't say much because bigger egos, sharper tongues, and an unending fixation on where Lennon and McCartney stood made it impossible for him to be heard. By the middle of the 1960s, George was filled with riffs and songs that were just as brilliant as anything Paul or John were writing, but when he offered them, they were turned down. Paul often thought of George's songs as side projects or afterthoughts that he could fit in between his own big ideas. John could be mean, ignoring George's work and calling it unimportant. When George played something powerful, like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, no one paid attention until he brought in Eric Clapton to play guitar. That's when everyone had to face what they had been trying to avoid. This wasn't just rejection for George, it was also shame. The unbalance got too much to handle. George could only have 2 or 3 songs on each album, while Lennon and McCartney filled the albums with their newest ideas. The way they felt was just as important as the numbers. Paul was a stickler, so he would spend hours making his tracks sound better. It wasn't as good when it came to George's songs, though. In the end, George himself said with anger, Paul would always help along when you'd done his 10 songs. Then he would help me with one of mine when he got around to it. It was stupid and self-centered. Because he was selfish, every studio session was like a battleground, and George felt like an unwanted fighter. The real sadness was about someone else. George and Paul used to be close, like brothers. As Paul took over the band more, though, George felt pushed further to the side. Once amazing, Paul's power made him feel suffocated, his clear directions. George didn't have much room to breathe because he insisted on playing bass lines, guitar parts, and even arrangements. In an interview in 1974, George said, I would join a band with John any day, but I couldn't join a band with Paul McCartney. He's a great bass player, but sometimes he's too loud. Behind that carefully chosen word were years of anger that had not been let out, a wound that never fully healed. By January 1969, the split had turned into a full-on war. Cameras caught the suffocating atmosphere at Twickenham Studios during the famous Let It Be practices. Paul gave a speech, John left, and George sat there quietly until he couldn't take it any longer. His words, which were cold and cool, broke the room apart. I'm gonna leave the band now. Get another one. After that, he left. The Beatles, who were the best band ever, were about to break up for 12 days. The world never knew how close they were to breaking up, not because of drugs or money, but because George Harrison couldn't take being turned down by the guys he used to look up to every day. When George came back, it wasn't to make peace, it was to give up. Apple Studios is where the band now lives, instead of Twickenham. Paul's plan for a live show was thrown out, and George agreed to go ahead with it. But something had broken in his heart. He was no longer friends with Paul. The respect had turned into anger. What used to feel like a family now felt like work. He wasn't a partner. He was a guest at a club, but they never right. There was more quiet than anger. It let everyone know that the hurts from being ignored, put down, and glossed over had never healed. For George Harrison, the Beatles were not the ideal group of brothers that fans thought they would be. They were locked up. What everyone else saw as unity, George saw as being confined. That pain he didn't say showed up in every note he wrote and every careful word he let the public hear. This pain was the reason George was no longer ready to keep quiet when history looked back. In the Beatles, his story wasn't one of giving up, it was one of struggle that was ready to come out. The fight to get George Harrison attention. When George Harrison joined the Beatles again in 1969, it wasn't a give up. The change was real. It was like something inside him broke at Twickenham Studios. Even though he went back into the studio, George wasn't the same person who used to be okay with being quiet. That's why he came back with a strong will. He didn't want to be the third Beatle in a group where only 2 men seemed too important. George Harrison was ready to fight from that point on. His weapons were not words. He didn't like getting into fights with McCartney or Lennon. His tool was music. No one had thought to ask George about the melodies, fragments, and polished lines of poetry he had been saving for almost 10 years. Too busy competing with each other and thinking about how smart they were, Lennon and McCartney didn't notice that George might be planning his own change. But the dam broke in 1969. Songs came out of George's guitar in a raw, urgent way that begged to be heard. The proof showed up in Abbey Road. The record was meant to be George's last, but for him, it was a welcome. Every record he made had only 2 songs, or 3 if he was lucky, for years. He never really thought about them. Now, though, George gave us Here Comes the Sun and Something. Not only were they good, you couldn't deny them. After months of trouble in the band, Here Comes the Sun, which was written in Eric Clapton's backyard, sparkled with hope. Another song, Something, was a pure act of love. It was such an international love song that even Lennon agreed it was the best song on the album. Paul said it was George's best work ever. Still more, Frank Sinatra called it the greatest love song of the last 50 years. They put out an A-side single with George Harrison's song Let It Be and John Lennon's Come Together for the first time. It was #1 on charts all over the world, which should have been a sweet victory. At last, George Harrison was no longer hidden from the world. But it was harder to tell who was who inside the band. Lennon seemed cold and didn't say much good about them. Paul, even though he was positive in appearances, still saw himself as the one who created the Beatles' sound. The quiet was too loud for George to hear. He broke through the wall, but the men who had fired him before didn't give him the applause he wanted. Instead, they were quiet, unwilling, and almost angry. That paradox was what made George's late Beatles years so sad. He wrote some of the band's most popular songs when he was at the height of his talent, but his wins were ruined by the environment. Every success made him think not of being praised, but of how long he had been ignored. Every praise felt late, forced, and empty. He was right the whole time, and that made the hurt worse. When the band finally broke up in 1970, George didn't wait long to show what he had been hiding for so long. While McCartney and Lennon started their own projects, George went off. It wasn't just a record, All Things Must Pass. It was a triple record full of songs that John Lennon and Paul had ignored, brushed off, or just didn't get. All of a sudden, the Quiet Beatle released a body of work that was so huge that it shocked everyone. Their first solo song to reach #1 in the US was My Sweet Lord. For George, it was proof of right. He wrote All Things Must Pass as a statement of independence and a cry of vengeance for being told for years that he wasn't good enough. People were amazed at how big it was. It was called the album that McCartney and Lennon did not see coming. But George wasn't happy with his success because it made him angry. He knew he could only make it happen. It was because the Beatles' cage had been broken. The band that should have helped him grow as a genius made him hide it until he could no longer keep quiet. Years later, Paul McCartney himself said that they had not thought George was as good as he was. It was easy to underrate George because John and I had always written and had most of the songs. Paul said this in an interview in 2020. The first time George wrote was a long time ago, but boy did he grow up. Some of the best songs ever were written by him. Even though it was honest, that statement was made decades too late. For George, it proved what he had already thought. The world made Paul realize how talented he was by making him look at his best work. Still, George couldn't get away from the scars of the past, even when he was at the top of his solo game. His anger came out in interviews like an old wound that had been sucked up again. In 1974, he was honest. I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. It wasn't just a bad review of Paul's songs. It was an end to the years when he felt suffocated, dominated, and pushed down. He said he could never see himself playing in a band with Paul again. It was clear that it was bitter. No matter how close they were or how long they had known each other, George could never fully forgive Paul. The tragedy was that success was empty. George had shown what he could do. He had #1 hits, was praised by critics, and won a Grammy. In 1971, he put together the Concert for Bangladesh, which raised millions of dollars for humanitarian help and was one of the first big benefit concerts in rock history. He was no longer just a Beatle. In his own right, he was a societal force. Still, George told the truth when he had some alone time. Being fired for so long hurt, and success didn't make it go away. He once said, partly in joke, that people would still think of his song as George's, even if it was the best song ever written, not as John or Paul's. This anger wasn't just about pride, it was about who they were. George joined the Beatles as the youngest member and their apprentice, the boy with big eyes. He was hoping that the band would change with him and give him room to become something else. Instead, the walls got closer together. The press's quiet Beatle label, Paul's need to be perfect, and John's sarcasm all made George feel trapped, erased, and silent. His later victories were acts of defiance, not joy. He didn't want to have to prove himself, but he did. Even in his book, I Me Mine George didn't say much about John Lennon and was careful when he talked about Paul. Fans were shocked by what was left out. George thought they were planned. He got rid of the guys who used to be bigger than him. It was the last act of defiance. If they ignored him in real life, he would ignore them in his mind. In the end, the quiet Beatle found his voice not in argument, but in silence turned into anger. But was he happy with it? That's the sad question. records that topped the charts, praise for his solo work, and respect from both reviewers and other musicians. George Harrison seemed to have it all. Paul finally accepted that he was great. People all over the world sang his songs, covered them, and made them famous. After a while, George himself seemed antsy, haunted by the years of being fired. In Indian thought, gardening, and getting away from fame, he tried to find peace. He filled his house with prayer and song, not cheers. Real recognition came too late for him, and it could never take the harsh truth about life after the Beatles, when broken friendships left scars that would never go away, the sad ending to George Harrison and Paul's fight. As the 1970s came to an end, the four Beatles moved off into their own lives. But while Paul McCartney turned his wounds into wings and John Lennon hid away with Yoko Ono, George Harrison was always known by one word: distance. They were not only far from what everyone thought would be another Beatles album, but also from Lennon himself. And by the time the 1980s came around, that gap had become solid. When John Lennon was killed in December 1980, the wall should have come down. Many Harrison fans pictured him breaking down in tears and telling the press that under all the anger, there was still a brotherhood that couldn't be broken. But things were much colder than they seemed. Harrison's answer was cautious and even awkward. He didn't talk about Lennon's death in the way of someone deeply sad, but in the way of someone who had lost someone he barely knew. It's too much to handle. Even though he was killed, his songs will live on. It was true, but the words were too harsh. Harrison's response showed how far Lennon had fallen in his love for her, which made millions of people expect their hearts to break. It was almost too quiet to hear. Paul McCartney had a hard time expressing his sadness and made the now famous comment that it was a drag. Ringo Starr flew to New York to make Yoko feel better, but George, he decided to stay in England, where he was surrounded by the solitude that Lennon had once laughed at as made up. People were shocked that Harrison, who had written his whole life about love, peace, and spiritual awakening, couldn't or wouldn't openly mourn Lennon's death. Fans mumbled, was the hate so strong that not even death could end it? The truth was, somewhere between disaster A and making it through, George had been feeling small, ignored, and laughed at by Lennon for so many years that his sadness was made harder by scar tissue. He thought that John Lennon's voice was more than just the sound of Think or Strawberry Fields. It was the same voice that laughed at his songs and sitar and said that his love for India was just an escape. Harrison had to mourn not only the death of a man, but also the end of a friendship that had never been healed. And in that moment, the silence was his last act of resistance. But being quiet had a price. George had nowhere to put his anger or hide his unresolved pain. He put all of that into his work. He released Somewhere in England in the early 1980s. Fans heard both the sound of an experienced artist and the echo of a man still dealing with hurts that time wouldn't heal. The music was both a way for him to flee and hide. It showed the world that he was moving on, even though his heart was stuck in the past. Harrison's heart never fully healed from the breaks it had over the years. It became a shield for him as his spiritual path grew. Friends noticed that he avoided talking about John Lennon directly a lot of the time. Instead, he would talk about karma, fate, or how short life is.